you're going to renew your driver's license, or when is it that your vehicle registration will come due? And this was a natural fit for me to be a moderator at this session, which is about looking at how data is shaping transportation decision-making. All of you will probably agree that over time, we have to support any kind of decision outcomes based on what we know, and data is critical on this. Over time, it was usually that we had one set of numbers. Maybe we had two, maybe we had three. If we look at the automobile, back 100 years ago when the Model T car started to develop, there was a few gauges, there's a few dashboards on there. The early parts about an automobile producing data started back then, the odometer reading. There was information about the number of hours that the engine was running. It was very relevant at that time. Today, hopefully our panel of speakers that we'll be introducing a little bit will give us a bigger insight as to how all of this is coming into and how it can support transportation in our decision making. You heard their earlier remarks at the beginning of today's conference of where we want to go, what are our challenges, and data plays a big role on it, and how we use that data to help convince people, policymakers, even some of ourselves about it. Not that we need any convincing. We all know that transportation is important. We know the challenges that we face. But how is it that we can best do our jobs by convincing other folks that something needs to be done? I am very, very happy that I'm going to be joined by a panel of 3 experts from SAS. And my job here today is really, really simple, and that is to welcome you and to tell you that we have probably about 15, 20 minutes of prepared remarks, but you guys are going to make up the rest of the time by asking questions based on what you heard this morning, what is going to be shared during this next 20 minutes. And we want you to kind of ask those thought-provoking questions about where is it that we see ourselves going as a society, and how we're going to be dependent, and how can we use data to help make those tough decisions. Because in my opinion, the easy decisions have already been made. The difficult ones are the ones that we're facing today. So I don't want to take any more time. I am going to introduce the speaker, Ann Dietz, who is with SAS. She is in the global transportation area, and she is now going to take it away and tell you how is the world looking at transportation. So help me welcome Ann.
Hi, everybody. Well, they did not tell me to keep things on time, so he's just going to have to keep me in control here. So thanks, Burt. I'm pleased to be here. My role at SAS is to lead the global government practice, and particularly around transportation and transportation agencies. In this role, I manage the marketing efforts and global customer engagement, including managing our partnerships with the International Transport Forum, on which SAS is a corporate partner, and the Smart Cities Council. I'm happy to be here today with 2 of my colleagues, and at the very end you'll see their pictures and their Twitter handles, but just real quick to know who they are. Katy Salamati, some of you from NCDOT already know her. She has a PhD in transportation engineering coupled with an MBA from NC State. She's an adjunct faculty member in civil engineering at NCSU. At SAS, she works primarily with departments of transportation, both federal and state, as well as local government, including transit agencies across the U.S. And for a different point of view, we also have Lonnie Miller. Lonnie Miller is a principal industry consultant in our automotive practice. He focuses on opportunities and risks with emerging technologies for the auto industry, and he's an expert on the role of analytics across customer experience, connected vehicle, and smart mobility strategies. So we're really lucky, and as Burt said, one of the things we really want to do is have an engaging discussion, not just pontificating from on high. We're only 3 feet above you guys anyway, literally, but figuratively, we're all on the same playing field, and please ask any questions, and let's have a crosstalk if we need to. Once I've finished my 10 slides, because there's no stopping me once I get started. So, let me turn on the... Okay, so As someone who gets involved in marketing, I'm obliged to tell you that if you want to tweet about today's wonderful presentation and panel, the hashtag is NC Transportation Summit. Okay, so, and we were going to have some poll questions, but we found out later that polls is only for the big room. So we may ask some questions and you can raise your hand, but right now we'll get to the presentation. So our topic today of how data is shaping transportation decision making, we're going to have 10 slides. We're going to spend more time on some trends, but then a little bit more on the data capabilities, including analytics, that are used to help transportation agencies and other entities make better decisions. And with those two elements as a backdrop, we're going to frame up the use cases that we've seen globally across the US and globally that exist and move on to the panel discussions. Panels are infinitely better than solo speakers, so I'm going to move quickly. Across the world, government agencies are increasingly using data and dealing with the trends that we've listed here. This is not all-encompassing. We have far more problems in this world than we have resources to solve them, but we listed a few here. So, safety, Vision Zero, topping the list of critical issues that departments of transportation need to solve. Multimodal transportation. Guess what? I have Uber on my phone. There's an app for that, but unfortunately there's an app for everything. And what we need in terms of multimodal transportation and what transportation agencies can do is join together to help citizens and consumers travel seamlessly from origin to destination, from the first mile to the last mile in their journey. And data from these apps, from information that we're getting, can support everything from forecasting demand across the modes to predictive maintenance of different modes of transportation, and can be used to manage contracts even across modes. There's a variety of new modes out there, from the scooters that we see outside of the North Carolina Convention Center to ride sharing, etc. There is a lot of weather in North Carolina. I should know because I changed my outfit selections 3 times based on different weather that we had last week, over the weekend, and the forecast for tomorrow. So we know that we need to prepare for the different kinds of weather. Governor Cooper today in his keynote talked about climate change and how that's affecting state and other agencies. And the ministries of transportation across the world are not treating this lightly. They know that that's going to have a big effect on transportation agencies and the needs going forward. In terms of CASE, also known as ACEs, depending on where you put the C, A, S, and E, connected autonomous shared electric vehicles. There's a lot to cover. That's one of the reasons we brought Lonnie with us today. And finally, the new world of unmanned aircraft systems, that's trending. There's a lot of data that's going to be available and a lot of new use cases in which data can help. But let's talk, and this is really where we want to focus. We're not focusing on the trends in transportation. We're all here because we know what's trending, but we're focusing on how data can help. The kinds of data that are available are different from 15 years ago. But it's also what you can do with the data that has really changed. It gives the ability in agencies to solve difficult problems. Applying analytics allows you to predict, to anticipate, and most importantly, to make data an asset for your agency and for the state of North Carolina. And one more thing about this is that it's not, these capabilities are not siloed. So real-time analytics is not going to be used alone without artificial and machine learning. And blockchain has to be considered in conjunction with data management and data governance policies. So even though I'm going to speak about these kind of individually, they're related to each other, and they are advantageous when they work together. So let's start with real-time analytics. The data that's coming from the sensors. It's physical devices embedded in the transportation infrastructure, sensors on moving assets, trains, automobiles, UAVs, to data captured from personal devices in motion. It's tremendous. Real-time analytics uses this data and enables decision-making in real time by capturing data in motion and then making decisions, taking actions when a particular set of criteria is reached. The sensors, or the gateway to the sensors, themselves are part of an operational intelligence framework. And based on what we learn from this data in motion, automobiles can tell other automobiles to avoid an area, to avoid an accident that's two miles ahead. Or trains can stop, they can change speed, they can do a lot of things based on the data that's coming from the sensors on board. Or UASs can survey an accident scene and with the help of analytics, make an immediate determination of whether you need to roll trucks to the side of the accident. We'll discuss more of this on the panel, and I hope we get lots of questions about this because of the exciting new world in terms of real-time analytics. I want to emphasize that real-time analytics is not just the analytics on one particular sensor. I mean, that's useful, but what you can really gain is the application of data from all sources, applying it in conjunction with the data from a sensor, building models, and then pushing those models out to where the data lives, out to where the sensor is, or to where the gateway is to make those decisions. That is when you can really see the value. Image recognition, this is one of the fastest growing capabilities in the data arena. Image capture from intersections, videos, they're helping agencies perform better traffic management. Drones bringing information to determine whether to roll trucks is another example. What is really different of late is doing this image recognition at the edge and applying machine learning to those images that are being captured. At SAS, we've been doing analytics for 40 years, but now everybody's talking about the third bullet, AI and machine learning. And really, people have asked how that is new from, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And in some instances, it's not new. But what really is new is applying the machine learning algorithms on data that is now unstructured. Not just data that is in structured databases, but data that is coming from image, from voice, from text. And the kinds of analytics that you can do with this kind of data, pattern recognition, recommendation engines. You've all seen recommendation engines, whether you wanted to or not. Last time you purchased something on Amazon, and then for 2 weeks later, the same thing or something similar was in your feed. You're like, I just bought that, why do I need another? So it can get better, let me tell you. But the other final things that you can do with machine learning and AI algorithms is predictive maintenance on rolling stock, predictive maintenance on infrastructure. Whoops, I went too far. Last two things, data management, the new capabilities around data management and data governance and data stewardship and elements of privacy. We talked about at one of the keynote areas about new taxes and putting devices on cars to see where people are driving. Privacy, that's going to be a major issue for many agencies, is how to balance the need for information and the need for privacy and making sure they're safeguarding citizens' privacy. So we know that infrastructure requirements to support data frameworks are not going to be cheap. So making sure that we have strong data management practices where we are storing the data that needs to be stored and getting rid of data that doesn't need to be stored, all of that is in the realm of data management. And finally, and we'll talk a little bit about distributed ledger technology, blockchain. I don't think the ledger portion of that capability is going to be as important as the events posted to the blockchain. Events in real time that you can analyze it as they're being posted. And one of the few implementations, there are very few, they're in healthcare or they're in financial services, they're not as much in transportation, but there are pilots and POCs going on. The critical component is going to be the ability to integrate, to unite or align different transportation silos that exist through the blockchain and bring about maybe an integrated mobility as a service. We as an industry don't have really a standard for that yet, so I think there's still a lot of work to be done on that. So, Vision Zero, and again, you're tired of hearing me speak already, I'm tired of speaking, but in terms of Vision Zero, it's important that we have more than one source of data to move us towards a safer transportation infrastructure. In the Netherlands, Rijkswaterstaat, which is the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water, one of the things they're doing with the data is they're positioning emergency response teams closer to the site of predicted accidents, predicted crashes. They're not waiting. They know that at 3 p.m. on this particular boulevard, you are more likely to see an accident than at 5 p.m. at another location. So if they can position emergency response vehicles and emergency response teams closer to where they already know, where they already are predicting an accident or a crash would happen, then they are going to save minutes in terms of lives and injuries. So, but what can we do in terms of other kinds of data? We know there's an underreporting of crash data. So can we augment it with hospital emissions data? Can we use video data? Can we tie all of this together and then create a really robust data set to be able to predict crashes and other incidents across the state? Had a question, what percentage of safety have we seen over the last few years? Just a quick poll of the audience. Have fatalities increased by 7%, 2%, stayed the same, decreased, 2%, 7%?
15%.
Decrease or increase?
Increased by 5.
Decreased by 2% in the last 2 years. Thank you. Sorry, over the history of time. No, just kidding. Multimodal transportation. I think really there's a host of data management and techniques and technology strategies that can be brought to bear across transportation issues. But in multimodal, that's where we really need the data management. Blockchain is going to be critical here, but what's really going to be critical, in my opinion, is the integration of state agencies, of regional transit agencies, of smart cities to come up with a lot of robust data analysis across counties. Transportation doesn't stop at a county line. If people are in one county and need to get to a health system in another county, they need a system that provides, and that's going to be multimodal. It's going to be a bus here, it's going to be an Uber there, it's going to be a walking trail or a bike there. So this data, like much of the newly available data, and is going to drive the new insights across multimodal. Okay, climate change and adverse weather preparedness. Again, as Governor Cooper mentioned, we are looking, and especially, and I say we, agencies across the world are treating this as one of their first missions. They're looking at decarbonization of transport. They're looking at things to help states be ready for the adverse weather that is going to result. Moving forward, the analytics that are used on board of a vehicle can also be used for vehicles nearby to let them know, but also infrastructure, the I part of V to I is going to be critical. Is there no water? Is there no water? CASE or ACES is being brought up because numerous entities aspire to know how to monetize and inspect newly generated data from the different modes of transportation, from cars and buses and trains. Whether it's a utility worried about power surges from too many electric vehicles recharging at a city station, or Lyft and Uber trying to optimize route data for shared ride orders, virtually every sector is thinking about how data is going to improve mobility and personalization goals when we have other choices beyond traditional vehicles. And finally, drones or UASs. What's fascinating here about the trends in UASs is how data is making things on the fly. Real-time analytics are going to be made. Image processes are going to be captured and applied on, at the edge with these systems using machine learning, using AI applications that benefit from this data. And data management strategies, are going to be required to store, manage, and share this data. Again, I took a very short time to cover a lot of issues, mainly because we want to hear from you. We want to have you ask us some questions. And thank you so much. This is my Marco Rubio moment. In the short time I had available, I hope I opened the topic enough to generate a few questions from the audience. I'll turn it over to Burt. You can leave this on for a few questions. And remember that the poll I took was not statistically significant.
While we give Leanne a little bit of a breather to catch her thoughts on, let me just go back and recalc a couple of things that I heard her say that I wish that you can take away. One, we need to think about data as an asset. Some of us have embraced that concept, others of us have not. We've been in the business of collecting data, at least at state DOTs, because at one time the federal government mandated that that data be collected. Some of us over time have questioned, is there a need for that data to still continue to be collected? Or should we change the way we do it? The other point is that data does not need to be collected in a silo. It needs to be collected in a way that it can cross-talk, that it can go from one place to another. Long time, I think we're past that time that we need to have data stored in a spreadsheet in one physical location, and if somebody wants to know about what's in that data set, that they have to come over and ask somebody for that. We should be able to share that data. With that, we're very sensitive about the issues of privacy. In North Carolina, we're very fortunate that the Department of Motor Vehicles is part of the state agency. There's a lot of private and sensitive information that's in there, but there's a wealth of data in there as well, that if you start to couple everything together, there's a lot of stuff and good things that we can do about it. Okay, so, Leanne, you ready? I'll start out and see if anybody has any questions. You have a great group of folks up here that can talk about anything about data, about analytics. Yes, sir.
My question is both as a member of the technology industry, but also a city councilman. And I guess, first with the comment and then a question, I think the challenge with technology innovation is that it's occurring at such a fast pace that if you look at the triangle region, the cities like Raleigh and Cary are really leading smart city initiatives and programs for data. But many cities don't know where to begin with, for example, transportation. Where do I begin with smart cities? Where do I begin to even know where to find the data? So that we as council members, when we're making decisions on urban development, we can actually go in real time and look at how many vehicle counts are on the road. Or a citizen might be able to use an app and look and say, well, what's the average wait time when traffic light Morrisville or Cary, so that I could go another way. So I could go on and on, but I really would like to hear from you in terms of what is your suggestion for cities around the state that are really, really falling behind because they're not a Raleigh or Cary, and they're all around the state. So I know it's an open-ended question, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Sure. So I'll take that. Thank you, Leanna. Thank you, Burt, for this panel. So we are seeing a lot of initiatives going in at the local government and also around at the state level and federal level across the country and internationally, that they are realizing there's a gap in that area. It's not easy to collect all this data, and there are gaps where the data is available or is not available. And so there are initiatives that are going on to collect more reliable and organized data. And one of the major initiatives that are going on, especially in a couple of states, is data management, enterprise data management, which, if you look at the cities or states, DOTs, you think of them as the infrastructure owner operator. You think of them as the agencies that would build the infrastructure and maintain the infrastructure and operate the infrastructure. But really now it's the matter of the data that comes in, that goes with that infrastructure, and how the infrastructure is operating. It's all about the data that you can collect from them. So the topic of data management has been a big topic. Enterprise data management has been a big topic, and also data sharing among various divisions of a state DOT or among various cities and counties. The cities and counties all coming together and sharing that data, especially even for the DOT. Sometimes you get the traffic counts, you mentioned the traffic counts, and DOTs might have some traffic counts available, but they would rely more on the cities and local transportation agencies to have a more reliable traffic counts available. So that data management is becoming bigger and bigger, data governance and data stewardship around that. And there are projects that are going on to be able to bring that data together and share the data among different divisions and organizations.
One idea that we've heard, my wife is a teacher, and I'm in Michigan, and one of the areas that they've been approached by with other agencies is you drop your kids off at school, and the parking lot, whether it's a nice roundabout or not, it's a nightmare for a lot of the design. A lot of the school districts will get approached to share the data on the children's and the family. So when the kids are registered in the district, they know the family data. And then they start correlating and seeing the growth and congestion and seeing so now they're doing traffic counts at the schools, and it's a starter set, kind of a little bit of a test cell and a proxy. We're seeing local communities where the growth and congestion from a school point of view, and then taking a look at the population that's tied to that student at the school. So maybe some collaboration with the school districts to help feed, because it's a natural setting where you're going to have, a recurrence of people using, that, and you have family data, tied to it.
Just one thing, Steve, right? One of the things that you can also do is join with your other communities, because some of this data, yeah, Cary and Raleigh have the wherewithal, and they do have some resources in order to put analytics together. And some of the other smaller communities are not, but by joining together, because things don't just stop at a city line or a county line. It's like public safety data, making that available across county lines and being able to just protect what you need to protect, but then use in a kind of a shared services environment, Morrisville and Apex and a variety of things, and then coming together and sharing that data, I think, is another option for them.
And let me add a few more other comments. I'll become moderator panel. Part you've heard about from the experts about the data collection, the data management, but also it has to be with the data sharing. I was in local government at one time, so I knew exactly what you're saying about where can I find this data. In the perfect world, we would launch a certain application, an app, if you will. You have a GIS map, you do a little circle around the area that you are, and you just go like on the tax record side. You go in and talk the parcel level, where the waterway is, where the flood line is on that. Can we do it? Yes. Sometimes perhaps we haven't done that because we're afraid of our own data. We're afraid that perhaps that data is not as clean, it's not as accurate as we want it to be. We got to take that risk, in my opinion. We have to go out there and say, okay, this data is out there. It may not be perfect, but it's better than none. As if I'm understanding you correctly, you're just hungry for that data to make some level of decision. And in the absence of no data, perhaps data that's not totally accurate might be a substitute for it.
And I think in this world, you cannot base your decisions on the most real-time accurate data. You are possibly making decisions that are incorrect, that do not reflect. And so when you're sitting in city council and you get looking at traffic counts, you don't know if those traffic counts are like at 6 o'clock in the evening, right before you take the vote. And so you're sort of in a blind spot. You see the estimates, right? So data doesn't lie. I mean, and I think that's exactly the point of my question.
And this is part of the conversation that we really wanted to have, is how can data support better decision making? And if you read the mission and vision of SAS as a company, it's very much in tune. There's a question from the gentleman back there, and then I'll come back to you.
Yeah, I'd like to challenge that statement that data doesn't lie, and use the example that was just published about Google's big data analytics in Flint, Michigan, where their big data analytics was supposed to identify where the lead pipes were. Lead pipes were supposed to get replaced, and it wound up costing Flint an enormous amount of money to find out that it didn't work. So you can say the data doesn't lie, but the algorithms sure can skew things certainly. So I'm curious if you have any examples about disasters, worst practices, or any things that we should be avoiding as we look at embracing big data as it relates to transportation.
You guys want to take a stand?
Yes. So as for the best practices, at least what I can relate to and what we do at SAS for the best practices is to understand every model that is developed has its own limitations. So the models are developed based on the data that are available, the historical data that are available, and obviously some of the data are reserved to validate the models later to make sure that what are the limitations of the models. But generally what we do is to understand that any of the statistical model, any of these big data analytics prediction models that are developed are based on a specific data that are collected due to some specific criteria around them. So whether they're specifically for, let's say for the winter operations, the models that are predict the roadway conditions during the winter operations probably can be applied for when there is a hurricane coming in and we have a lot of rain and flooding. So that's how we try to make sure that there are validations and there are criteria around how the models can be used, and there's always that confidence interval, when we call it, in terms of the statistics, where you always have that level of error, and we also take that into account. So we're all aware of that the models, the statistical models, or the artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies that we develop have their own limitations, and what we need to take into account is what those limitations are. And so I guess when there are these disasters happening, as you mentioned that, it's because those models are taken out of the context or they're applied to the areas that shouldn't be applied.
And I want to contrast Katy's comments, since the question started with Flint. I grew up in the Flint area. So you can have math, machine science as best practice, but another big one that we see across all of our verticals with our customers is the culture and the willing for the humans that are making the decisions to trust what an output is. So I also know that in Flint, the universities that had worked on developing some of the models and said dig in this yard and not in that yard because the probability of having the right detection on lead, things were slowing down, and the mayor chose to say we're going to go faster and rip up all the yards that we can, because I got residents that are yelling at me saying, hey, my neighbor got dug up, I didn't. Why didn't you look in my yard? So what happened is they said, forget the models, we're going to rip it, search. Their incidence of finding lead pipes went down to below 20% when they were north of 78%, and they stayed the course with the math. So it's a cultural thing. You have to have your leadership, and you talk about analytics, and I don't care what agency, what organization, if it's not, it can be an incubator and a nice, experiment, right, in a few teams, but you've got to evangelize it internally and let it kind of cycle back from the top, so then decisions. There's not an automaker that lets some auto algorithm trigger a recall for their fleet. No way. There's going to be humans looking at that, looking at the risk and things, but there are automakers that are saying, in terms of a safety issue, how quickly can we reduce all the scrutiny before we trigger a recall voluntarily before someone like NHTSA, gets in our face.
I'll just go back and add one more comment, and that was with the last set of snow events that we had a couple of weeks ago. The predictive models for the amount of snow, where and when it would happen. The National Weather Service based here in Raleigh gave a spot-on forecast of what was going to happen. that was very beneficial to the Department of Transportation because it allowed us to position the right number of equipment, treatment, and resources to meet a response time. You had a question, sir? Okay. Somebody had a...
Yeah, I enjoyed playing around with numbers and statistics, but one of the things that from a local level, when we're trying to make a decision, especially as it pertains to transportation, we'll have a developer or someone come in and talk about, you know, transportation studies that they've done. And when you're making a decision, I'm always curious because sometimes you can plug in different data to make it kind of the way you want it. And I was just wondering, like, is there a movement in North Carolina or any standardized way to judge these traffic studies or resources? Or, you know, I think sometimes you spoke about all the data that we can get from our own resources. You know, what software is available, or where do we have to develop our own? And is there some type of sort of standardized way that you can follow to say, like, in this area, these things are happening, and you know, this is the impact from it. I just feel like sometimes it's not consistent ever. Does that make sense?
Are you referring to perhaps the figures that are published in the ITE trip generation model, which is at the heart of traffic impact studies?
Yes. Is that, I mean, again, I'm speaking in more layman's terms because I'm not familiar with all that, but I just know when I'm making a decision, I get a lot of information. A lot of times it differs depending on who's giving it to you.
So I'm sorry to disappoint you, but that's really what the reality is at this point. Although everybody started to realize that and recognize that, and especially around the transportation planning and the planning data, which the planning data is the models are the models that are in ITE. They're very old, probably 20 years old or something, that they need to be updated. And also all the data that is collected on the trip generations for building those models. But they are initiatives going on that are looking at standardizing those traffic data collections and also updating the models. The only thing that I can say that is promising is that they are, everybody started to realize that, especially because we have more data available compared to 20 years ago, and we have more technologies available. We really know what the gaps are and what the caveats are, and we have more at our fingertips. We have, the crowd sharing information. The transportation industry.
Okay.
Whether it's private or public, or at each of these levels, we have more access to the data. So maybe like 10 years ago, we couldn't really utilize the cell phone data for transportation planning for trip purposes. Now we have all the cell phone data that are available through the cell phone carriers or some third-party companies that will help with that trip generation data analysis. And so having all these data available, I guess it's now the time that the researchers and the decision makers, when it comes to all those developing all the models, they're all coming together to see how they can utilize the data that is available to us, and how we can either update the models, make it more standardized. And it goes for any of these technologies that are available. I mean, the transportation planning has been around forever, but now we have the new technologies with the UAS and with the connected autonomous vehicles that are all going to generate a lot more data and needs to be standardized. And so that's something that I guess all the industry started to realize that, and there are consortiums forming to develop those standardization. We still have to wait.
That's what I was going to say. In the meantime, we just wait, right?
Well,
my recommendations for now.
Mm-hmm. Or join one of these groups.
I got one more. This may be a hypothetical question, but maybe a few other people in here that have required the in high school of 1984 well, and also anybody on the panel has read it. But if you haven't, you should read it. What have you considered putting in place, and what do you envision being put in place to keep from coming to a reality
Okay, so if you haven't read the book, so, sorry. Yeah, so the question essentially, if you're, how can you avoid what happened already? No, how can you avoid in the book that was dated? So the thought police are a scary concept in that book, and they're watching you, and there's vivid illustrations of having to stand in front of a small monitor and be seen doing your exercises and whispering in low tones, and not being subversive to the government, etc. I know from the standpoint of all the automakers, and Burt mentioned this on the data privacy point that Leanne mentioned too, when you talk to them about the shared data, right? You go to the dealer and you buy a car, you sign up for an app, you have an OnStar subscription, a Hyundai Blue Link subscription, etc. That data is not going anywhere. That stuff's in a vault. Mercedes or BMW, I think it was BMW, has such transparency that they tell the drivers the vehicle data is being used and not used for the following. And if you want to restrict us further, I'm giving you such an easy way to know about it. I think they call the program BMW data, in fact. But the credo is, it's the customers. We're not going to alienate our future revenue stream and reputation around that. Now that's from a private sector standpoint. That hypothetical boogeyman, vision that Orwell illustrated, I think what we see in both private and public sector is the collaboration. The fact that you've got a summit like today, you've got all walks of entities here. It's because we are open and trying to make sure we're not stabbing each other in the back or running ahead before some other standards are going to alienate someone else, etc. So I think that openness, that's certainly in that horrific world that Orwell thought from his UK upbringing was taking place. That's my thought. But the data cannot just be dilly-dally shared with everybody in one regard.
Another question?
Good answer.
Yes, I have a question about the definition of the big data. A couple of years ago, when you Google, you'll find that big data is a 3V, volume, velocity, and variety. Nowadays, you will find that as a 5V, they add variety and value. As a subject matter expert, do you think, or your vision, that by going more 6V, 10V, 25V, that's the first part. And the second part, how we define this data for a local small town or city? This is the data that's set, it's not like big agency or department as well. So how do you define that? Do they have a big data or not?
So big data, like a lot of things, is in the eye of the beholder, right? A small city that doesn't have the wherewithal and the resources, the data for 15,000 citizens is big for them, and for Raleigh, it's one problem they're solving for 800,000 citizens. So I think it's my belief is that big data, it doesn't matter. It's data, and if it's big, then you deal with it in one way, and if it's smaller, it could be big to you. So that seems obvious, but whether there's going to be 7, 12, 14 V's, first of all, we'll run out of V letters, but what I think the V that you added, veracity, right? If I heard you right, I mean that's the truth issue that the gentleman over here was talking about, is making sure that the data reflects what you are actually seeing in the situation at hand. And one of the things that analytics can do is prove that data to be accurate. Is this an anomalous situation? The data that I have right here, is that what I expect to see regularly, or is that a unique situation? So I think that, first of all, big data is in the eye of the beholder, and you have to treat it as whatever your use case is, whatever your problem. If you're solving a public safety problem, you're solving a transportation health problem, solve the problem at hand, and don't worry if the data is 17 trillion terabytes or 1 megabyte of population data in your city.
Well, just wanted to add one more thing about the big data, and that's what I guess the founder of our company would say, define big data as you're dealing with data when the conventional way that you have to analyze that data doesn't really respond, and you need to look for more, high performance, basically softwares or capabilities to analyze that data. So it's really relative into what your capabilities are. When it gets out of your capability, then it's really big data.
Before we go to the next question, I just want to interject one other comment, and that is, we haven't talked about the T word, technology. All of this type of data collection, the use of data, is being made easier because of technology. If you stop to think about it for one moment, the smartphone that most of you have in your hand has more computing capability than all of the computers that were used to launch the first moon rocket. That's a lot of power. And it's starting to get into smaller and smaller pieces of space. If we think we have a lot of data, if we think we have a lot of needs today, I would say that in another 4 years, the challenges are going to be greater. But one of the issues that we need to really be thinking about is how can we think about all of this data that's coming, that's being collected, that's being stored, that's not being shared, that is being shared, to make the world of transportation better, to provide better connectivity between transportation modes, to help us reduce accidents, to help us predict natural disasters better. Perhaps maybe there's even an idea of how we can leverage that data as a revenue source, which is something that we all are trying to figure out. How does that all work? That is part of the that is part of why we want you to be here today, and you graciously have come, is to help us look through all of this. We have ideas. We're, at the end of the day, through big data statistics, we're trying to predict human behavior, predict nature. That's part of the equation, but how we use all of that for other purposes that help us be better, as transportation professionals, to help the well-being of our state and the country and the world for that matter. Final questions. We might have time for 2 more questions. Yes, sir.
Down at ground level, we're trying to understand here. Is NCDOT using correlated data? For example, they collect the majority of the data for MPOs and RPOs in the state, not all, but the majority. So let's just take a category that would go into the algorithms relative to safety. Is your group looking at correlated big databases to predict or check the accuracy of those safety numbers that are being, that NCDOT, for example, is deriving?
You want to take that? Okay. You first got to realize that we at NCDOT have enjoyed a working relationship with SAS. I tell folks a lot of times that I ran into some issues where I needed help on statistical analysis, and I just looked out my window and there was a company 10 miles down the road, SAS, that has come over to help us. I can talk, and so we're fortunate that they're nearby, but then we have to enter into a contractual obligation to see how it is that they can help us on that. I can talk more about how they're helping us in the area of finances, but your question is very specific about how can they help in predicting perhaps accidents and so forth. So I'll let Katie.
So specific to NCDOT, we haven't got to that point to look at the safety data. But as part of any of the work that we're doing for any of the organizations, the first part is really look at the quality of the data to see what type of data are missing. If you're expecting to see a record that has 5 letters and 2 numbers, but we're finding that there are records that have 2 letters and then 5 numbers, then these are data quality problems. The data is not in the right format. They're missing data, or the data it's not what it's supposed to be. So these are the areas. These are the standard practice of every analytical project that we take on to look at what the quality of the data is, how much of that data is missing, and some of the missing data, especially the missing data, is something that we can point out, but it's not that we can go back and fix it. If there was a problem at the what we call it the system of record, where the data was recorded, that's where the areas that it needs to be looked at, how that data could be collected better and to improve the quality of the data. But our standard practice helps us to identify what those gaps are and what those missing data are for any of the analytical problem. And then as we go through this exercise, then we understand what we have that we can work on to develop reliable models. And again, going back to what I said earlier, then we understand what the limitations are that we can use that models for. But particular to the safety data, we have other practices across the country where particularly SAS has been involved in with the safety data, traffic crash data, not only in US. For example, NHTSA is the big SAS user, so all the data that you see on the crashes from being collected from all the other states is something that is SAS in the background running, doing the quality control of the data, integrating the data with other data sources, with the demographics as well, doing statistical analysis. That's all being handled by us. And also in other countries around the world that Leanne mentioned, the Dutch Ministry for Infrastructure that are using data analytics capabilities to now predict. So that's the key to reducing the safety and crashes is really to do predictions so that we are not waiting 5 years for the safety data to be collected and then we're going to go and analyze it later. We want to prevent the crashes to happen. So we want to predict how we can predict and how we can model where the hot spots of the crashes are and be able to pre-position the emergency responses or the law enforcements or any of the measures that we can take to get to the hot spots, the crash locations faster, either clear that out or take predictive measures. If you're expecting an event going on or if you're expecting adverse weather condition happening, that's where a lot of the the crashes might happen. So how we can prevent that by predicting that. Does that? I think I went a little bit further than what your question was, but I wanted to know if that helped.
What I'm trying to get at is your model more predictive? Would her model ever substitute the actual empirical data collected by NCDOT in terms, for example, of SDI appropriation of money for scoring? In other words, would you use, which model would be superior, or is that a goal to move in that direction? So you can anticipate.
Right.
each
So
forecast.
one thing that I would add is that our models also are being continuously updated. So as we collect more and more data, it's more of an it's the same as the basis for machine learning technology. So as we collect every year that we're collecting more data, we're updating the models to make sure we have the most accurate one. We're taking into account all the constraints that are related to that data. So it's an ever-changing, evolving practice to make sure that the models are reflecting all the data that are available to us. But that's just, the models will help with the decision making.
Have time for one more question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so the transportation agencies have been collecting massive amounts of pavement distress data for quite some time now, just like traffic data. But traffic distress data is used for HPMS reporting or whatever. But that is such a small segment, and a lot of agencies are trying to do program development, optimize on project selection. So how do you square up what the data actually says, political reality of what projects need to go? And I see you respond, you know what I'm saying. And so do you have a committee or how do you, because the data tells you what to do, and or at least it tells you the reality of the needs out there. So how do you square up the needs versus political reality of someone wanting a project
Boy, that's a loaded question. It almost goes to the question that the gentleman was asking. You're asking from a maintenance and operations side of programming, where the gentleman was asking the question from a capital standpoint. From the capital standpoint, North Carolina DOT moved about 6 years ago to a data-driven process for how to prioritize projects based on a set number of criteria that looked into congestion, economic benefit, safety, and a few other factors as well. Did we get it right the first time? No, but it was pretty good. That's why every 2 years, if I remember correctly, we're updating that priority basis and so forth. And who knows, as we start to get more, better data in a quicker time frame of refresh, we might be able to get to where you're looking at. For your part, sir, about the HPMS, you're totally correct. Sounds like you definitely know that the HPMS is being collected on a statistical sample across every state. My point is that that was the method that the Federal Highway Administration prescribed. Whether it's the correct one, probably was at the time it was developed. Does it meet our needs today? Absolutely not. But it's a way that allows for comparison among state DOTs to where we really can kind of benchmark ourselves. I know that our maintenance and operation folks are looking at that very same part, is how can we have more reliable data on it, more timely data. I go in and say, rather than taking statistical samples, I'm going to make up a number of 1,000 across the state because you have to deploy a crew to go out there. Is there technology out there as drones? Can vehicles actually collect that data? That is part of the conversation that we want to have with all of you as transportation professionals of how can we make all of this data work better for all of us. So stay tuned. I don't think that chapter has been written altogether. It's being written, and we're looking for your collective input for how we can improve that. Well, folks, it's 2:57. They asked me to finish here on time. If you got here a little bit late, I want to thank you as the audience for coming here today and spending an hour trying to learn about big data and how it can help us make better decisions. Help me thank our panel from SAS. I've tried that before.